why are we finding it so hard to change?
That's going to change our cities so radically.
It'd be very, very, very difficult now to introduce a mileage tax.
I don't think that cars are going anywhere, but I think that drivers are.
I'm Henrietta Moore, and I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London.
Hi, my name's Arthur Kay. I'm the co-author of Roadkill with Henrietta, and then I sit on the board of a number of organisations, including Transport for London, the Royal Academy of Engineering, and the Museum of the Home.
Thank you both for coming in. It's very exciting to have a duo. And it would be interesting, I think, for listeners to learn, before we talk about your book, Roadkill, to know how you guys originally met and where the idea to write the book came from.
Well, we originally met because we started doing something together with an organisation called Fast Forward 2030, which is about young entrepreneurs who are delivering on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And Arthur is an award-winning entrepreneur. And I was the person who thought this would be a really good idea to get all these guys together and to reattach them to the new ideas that are coming out in universities and see if that could somehow help them take things forward. So that's how we got together.
And how quickly did that turn into this idea about cities and cars and the sort of loss of freedom that has come from car ownership?
Well, cities were always a big feature of it because they're such a big feature of the Sustainable Development Goals. And everybody's talking about, recycling, circular economies, how to have sponge cities, how to have greener spaces, all of that kind of stuff was already there. And that's something that lots of entrepreneurs are working on. And Arthur will tell you a little bit about his first business, which also was making a contribution in that space. But we really got interested in the question of cars because we got caught up in this problem, which I think is a problem we're all caught up in, which is why are we finding it so hard to change? We all know what the situation is. We all know what's happening with climate change. We all know what's happening to our cities. They're getting more and more unlivable. They're getting hotter, wetter, dirtier, more exclusive rather than inclusive. In general, very difficult spaces to be. And lots of people want to work on that, and lots of people are working on it. But if you start talking to people about what can we do about our cities, then you'll find that the car is at the heart of it.
Yes. Do you want to, Arthur, just introduce a bit about your background, and then we'll come back to that point, which I think is really interesting. And so, some of the culture war stuff around cars and the limitations of cars is completely mind-boggling. And worth probably talking about. But Arthur, do you want to just give a bit of your background, some of your businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is I studied architecture at UCL and then randomly went into entrepreneurship, which maybe for some of the architecture listeners maybe is not so random because architecture is a very good grounding to take you into lots of different directions from there. The first business was called BioBean, manufacturing biofuels and biochemicals from used coffee grounds. And the second, Skyroom, looking to increase density in our cities by building new buildings in the airspace above existing buildings. And it was actually that second business, Henrietta was talking just now about our work at Fast Forward 2030 and the work at the Institute for Global Prosperity. And it was really the groundwork for that first business, which resulted in a publication we worked on together called Rise Up, which was looking at the kind of theory of change and the kind of broader macro concepts behind Skyroom and what we hope to achieve with it. And so it's these sorts of tactical interventions about how the Institute and Fast Forward 2030 specifically can work with early stage entrepreneurs who are interested in doing something with a social or environmental impact, by looking to sweep that in not just a commercial setting, but also a broader kind of theory of change about what positive impact this could make in the world if it was to be delivered.
And Henrietta, why do you think it is that people, particularly when it comes to the urban realm, find change so difficult?
Well, I think partly because they feel that cities are big spaces that are somehow fixed. I think if you're an architect or if you're an urban designer, you don't think that. But I think if you're an ordinary person and you're trying to cross a 4-lane highway somewhere in America, you probably do think that this infrastructure isn't going to change anytime soon. And the other thing that people are worried about is how can they have access to things that they need? Because actually many people are already experiencing exclusion of some sort. So you can't necessarily just walk outside your door and go to a pharmacy or pick up your groceries or go to a doctor or do anything that you might want to do. In fact, if you have to go to the gym, you probably have to travel to the gym, which is one of the reasons why many people actually go to the gym from work. It's more convenient than from home. So this sets up all kinds of things where people actually believe that they're getting access through the way in which they use the city currently. So if you suggest a change to them about how that city should be used, what people immediately feel is that they're being excluded further, or that they fear without even realizing it necessarily. So we say consciously, they think, okay, that change is not going to be for me.
And to build on that, in the book, we introduce this idea of car blindness, kind of the infrastructure, the physical cars, but also the infrastructure around us that is built into our cities that then dictates the way that we then go and live our lives. One example, which is a very extreme one, because it involves kind of Robert Moses and his work in New York and the racist ideology that he was trying to impose, is a really striking example. And I'm just kind of lifting this from the book here. One of the things that Moses wanted to do was to try and ensure that the new public spaces and beaches that he was providing access to were limited by what he called the right kind of New Yorker to enjoy. And what he meant by that was middle-class white New Yorkers rather than other kinds of New Yorkers. In doing so, one of the things he did, which was very pernicious, was design the bridges to get from the centre of the city to places like Jones Beach out to the north of the city, and ensure that those bridges were so low that a private car could go under them, but not so tall so a bus could go underneath them. And because public transit was primarily used by non-white and poorer New Yorkers, these were seen as the quote-unquote right kind of New Yorker. So it's these, what may seem at the time relatively small, relatively subtle things, the height that a bridge is set at, but actually then can then dictate the way in which different kinds of parts of the city can be accessed, and in this case, really valuable public space.
So why do you think, I mean, that you know, I do think that there's a tradition, I suppose, of dating from the 60s onwards of car blindness, or like cars leading the design of the urban realm. I wouldn't say that is the case currently in London, you know, and I think like a lot of the schemes that we design are very, very low car ownership. You know, we're just doing a 270 unit scheme, and it's got 6 parking spaces, which is for the people accessible only, blue badge. Why is now the time for this book to be written?
Well, I think because there is, as you say, movement behind what should be a big change that needs to come. So you're already doing that in your professional work. And, you know, if you had been doing this 20 years ago, you would have been demanding car parking spaces for lots and lots of people. And every time we have demanded car spaces for communal housing of some sort, we basically are effectively building those car spaces into the price of the housing. So the housing crisis that we are living in currently is actually driven in part by the fact that we've given over so much of our cities and so much space to cars. And I think that although that's changing, it's not changing nearly fast enough. So you'll be aware that whilst you're doing that in your professional work, that there are other developers who are struggling with this problem about how do people in those housing units get access to the public space, which should be a public good, i.e. the gardens around the houses or communal living spaces that are being developed. And there are quite a few examples in London of the fact that if you're in the so-called social housing element of those developments, you will find it very difficult to use some of that green space. And there's been lots and lots of discussion around that. So there's still contestation over space. And cars are a big part of that contestation because they take up so much of it.
And if we look at London as a city, London is one of the most progressive in terms of trying to move people from driving to other genuine, affordable, reliable, safe alternatives. So one of the roles I have is on the Board of Transport for London. We have an ambition there to move roughly from 65% of journeys made through active travel, walking, cycling, and public transit, so buses, tubes, overground rail, etc., to 80% by 2040. So there's a kind of a ambition to bridge that 15% gap. But that's actually a pretty good percentage compared to a lot of cities around the world. So we look at the kind of some big rich cities in America. American households, roughly 94% of American households have access to a car. Americans drove 3.2 trillion miles last year. So they are locked into a car-dependent life cycle versus a city like London, which has really been a pioneer in terms of public transit, from literally inventing the underground to obviously the country inventing the train. But one of the points as well, which Henrietta has a huge amount of knowledge on, and I'm sure we'll come back to, is around the really big, what we call kind of the battlegrounds for the car over the next 10, 20, 30 years, which are the big mega cities in the global south. Because these are places where you have relatively low levels of car ownership today, where if you look at a country like India, you have the biggest country by population in the world and also the biggest democracy in the world. Roughly 9% of India's population have access to a car. So relatively small percentage. The reason for that is driven mainly by a lack of economic prosperity, that they don't have a car because they can't afford one, rather than don't have a car because they don't want one. Mm-hmm. But if you then move those percentages from 9% to the American model of 94%, you're then going to snarl up not only the Indian cities, but also completely transform that economy to a car-dependent, car-centric one, where people are spending a vast amount of their household income on cars. So I think part of this is taking a city like London as a place which is already doing quite a good job, but could do a much better job, and then trying to also work in a progressive way, and a potentially way that you can leapfrog a lot of that, what we think is a red herring, going down the car infrastructure route and try and get to where London is today rather than where America is today.
And what are the sort of recommendations that come out of the book then, in as far as it would apply to, say, a European city that's the age of London versus a sort of relatively newer city or a rapidly expanding city in the global south?
Well, I think the recommendations that come out in the book we're very careful in the book to start with things that are already happening. So it's not that we come from sort of Mars with a new idea that no one's ever thought of before, right? So we are, making those points which architects have made for a very long time, which is, let's design our European cities around people, right? Mm-hmm. Let's reclaim the street. Let's make it possible to cross the street, for one thing. Let's think about low traffic neighborhoods. Let's think about, super blocks, as in Barcelona. Let's think about what's going on in Milan and in Paris, which is a great example. I mean, if you've been walking down the River Seine any time recently, you'll have had a much better experience than you would have had 20 years ago. The problem is that not all of the population are entirely happy with it, to say the least. And then it brings other challenges that you have to look into, which is, how do you manage your mobility on two wheels when you actually have a lot of people who are mobile on their 2 feet? So there are all sorts of challenges which go on. But if you're talking about the global south, so one of the things that's interesting about the global south is the way that those cities are already starting to work with what they have. So they have what you might call informal mobility systems. So this would be things like communal buses in Kenya, which are called matatus, which are an informal mode of transport. They pick up wherever you hail them. They go wherever they want to in terms of where people are. They're not on fixed routes, so they move around quite a lot. And at some point in the discussion, the Kenyan authorities moved from saying, okay, these people in matatus, they're really behind the curve. They're not really a proper public transport system, so we should get rid of them, right? To saying, okay, actually, this is the transport system we have. Yeah. We can't afford to do the whole official bus system in the same way. So what would happen if we actually integrated the informal system, which is on demand, with the formal system? And the result of that is that you have rather a lot of matatus on the road in Kenya, but you do have the ability to move large numbers of people quickly.
So going back to the European point, you sort of mentioned the experience of Parisians perhaps resisting what from the outside looks like just the most amazing transformation of their urban realm, to the point where I think London is now looking at a similar thing, but as usual, it takes 20 years to pedestrianise Oxford Street, whereas Paris, top down, they're just like, right, we're going to just pedestrianise the whole centre of Paris, and you just have to lump it. And there's something to be said for the difference in approach of our kind of, when it comes to large infrastructure projects. I think the French way is less democratic, but perhaps more effective. But it does then alienate people, and we have the same problem, I think, in the UK, where it's being seized. Transportation, and particularly car ownership or car freedom, seems to be being seized upon by the right or by kind of sometimes the radical left, to act in a culture war. And I can't quite understand how it's happened. And I think it started originally in Oxford. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your kind of perception of how that's happened and how we can maybe manage that and try and separate this out to be an infrastructure debate, not a culture war debate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Henrietta will talk more around that, and particularly did a lot of the work in the book around the kind of philosophical grounding and how this then did become kind of what's kind of the groundwork philosophically from this, then how it then got caught up in the culture wars. But there's just a very small point here around one of those small pieces and around how bizarrely a very similar urban form can be made left wing or right wing by the forces that be. The cul-de-sac and the low traffic neighbourhood, the LTN, are in essence almost identical in terms of urban form. They are a way to manage traffic and to access routes through a place, which means that you can then access a place and or not access a place in this place, but with no through traffic or the super block. The cul-de-sac is typically seen as a relatively small c conservative approach. It's brought in context of kind of suburbia, kind of mid to late 20th century, and probably a more kind of right-leaning approach, whereas the LTN has been kind of seen as this kind of radical left approach and top-down piece. And so I just thought this was an interesting thing I heard the other day as a very similar urban form which has been hijacked from left to right. And I think a lot is about who was doing it to whom, and also how it's then picked up by the media at the time. Henrietta, I know you've got kind of written a lot in the opening chapters on the book around freedom and the impacts of that.
Well, I think that one of the issues is if we're talking about low traffic neighbourhoods, for example, which is very contentious in parts of London. And part of the problem here is that once you have put a low traffic neighbourhood in, there are very few people who live in the low traffic neighbourhood who then say they want it changed back again. Now, a lot of this depends on their access, but there's a very good example from Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia. So when they decided to block off various streets in the centre of Ljubljana, people were furious. There was protests all over the place. Now they've had that in place for some time. When people were interviewed quite recently about this and asked what they thought about having the street pedestrianised or having it car-free, is they said, well, why would you want to drink a beer next to a car? You know, you much prefer to have a beer next to a person. So, I mean, you know, this is the way that sometimes these debates are taken up by people to put forward various kinds of positions without necessarily thinking through all those positions. So one of the things we do in the book is to ask the question, what do we actually know about some of the issues surrounding cars in the city? Do we actually understand whether the freedoms we cherish now are the freedoms that we should really have? So, for example, Oxford was the place where quite a lot of this started, and whilst we were doing the book, I was in correspondence with someone who I shall call John Oxford. So John Oxford was writing to me saying, I need to be able to drive my car anywhere at any time and park where I want and park outside, you know, where I'm going, and I don't see why I should have to, you know, go through all these 20-mile-an-hour things and all the rest of it, you know, traffic calming schemes that the city has. And of course, so Mr. Oxford there is forgetting a number of things. So we do have a number of rules that already apply to cars. So you have to drive on one side of the road. You have to stop at red lights, right? You can't just do what you want to do. And we've already agreed that we want to do those things because we think they're better for us, right? Catalytic converters are another thing that we agreed. You know, the industry standard, regulated, we agreed to it. You never hear people protesting about catalytic converters. Although at the time, they didn't like them, just like they didn't like seatbelts at the time either. So a lot of this is about how things can move through public appreciation and public debate. And the root of it is how much input do the public have in the first place. So very often they don't have much input. And your low traffic neighbourhood will work well, provided it's only a low traffic neighbourhood. But if you go and shove Old Street Roundabout, which is a big roundabout in London that's been redesigned several times, right next to one of your low traffic neighbourhoods, you're going to have a massive problem because you've basically blocked up all your arterial roads and then you've put in your low traffic neighbourhoods on top of that. And the result is, as this morning when I came to see you, a massive traffic jam.
Well, we should say today's tube strike day, so it's been experimental forms of transport have become the norm, and it was like a sort of lime bike dodgems on a lot of the streets, which was quite fun. I think what struck me that was quite interesting from like an architect's perspective is you got to a situation where you have to be careful using terminology. So 15-minute city, it came out of that same thing. So the Oxford low traffic networks, I think, were happening at the same time as COVID was happening, and there was quite a lot of misinformation swirling around, and there became quite a lot of basically conspiracy theory around 15-minute cities, that they were, we were in lockdown, and with a 15-minute city, it meant that you weren't able to leave that 15 minutes city, and we were going to be like sort of divided up into these little kind of easily controllable. I mean, this is the conspiracy theory, and it went all the way through this sort of mad cycle. But then it got picked up by the mainstream media kind of later, and publications like the Daily Mail were like, "Well, this is an outrageous restriction of people's rights." And so now, really, 15-minute cities as an expression has kind of been dropped. Like, I don't think people say it as much. They're, I think, careful to say pedestrianising roads, or like using phraseology that isn't associated with that, because it did, like, sometimes people's perception, you just know this thing is controversial, so avoid using that expression. And I think that's a bit sad.
No, completely. And I mean, the top quote here on our book here is from Carlos Moreno, author, creator of the 15-minute city concept and author of the book. And in it, we talk about, he off the back of those protests and others was received death threats, and in fact had to have 24/7 security for him and his family throughout that period. I think it was tied up in kind of broader conspiracies around kind of the World Economic Forum promoting it as a theory, and then COVID and all this kind of stuff too. And so, but it is bizarre. I mean, it's probably the most famous a relatively niche urban design policy has ever become, and potentially kind of controversial and dangerous it's ever become as well. Where it shows how kind of toxic, dangerous and controversial what a relatively niche urban design policy can come if picked up with that. But I think what 15-minute city is about, if I was going to give a generous interpretation, is it's the option to have things that are important to you in your life, however you define you and your life's important things, in your neighbourhood. So if you happen to be someone who really, really loves waking up, walking to go and get a coffee and then picking up your morning paper, it's the ability to be able to do that in your neighbourhood without necessarily having to jump into a car.
Well, I think well-designed places already are 15-minute cities.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's lots of them in London, because London was a series of villages. So actually, it's got quite a lot of like node points, and that's
the existing infrastructure is there for it.
Yeah, exactly. It's naturally evolved over time, and lots of old cities are like that. They've got multiple node points because they're villages that got swallowed up.
Exactly.
Whereas when you get a new, it's when the architects are in charge, and you don't have this long vernacular like design process where things have evolved, and you do that kind of top down, right, we're going to build a new city. In the line in the desert, will there be a series of node points that are 15-minute cities? I don't know.
Well, in a bizarre way, we've got other views on that, but in a bizarre way, they are trying to do that. But whether it happens is exactly.
It probably all will be quite walkable, but because it's not going to be very much of it.
Exactly, and one of the people you're right. And we tie that very specifically to the mode of transport, i.e., when the only ways to get around your city were, walking, cycling, by horse and cart. Essentially, your neighbourhood became roughly 15 to 30 minutes, because that was how far you could conveniently walk to get stuff done. And as the car came in, became ubiquitous, it changed that. And so one of the case studies we bring in the book is around Milton Keynes, a city that was exactly that. Oliver kind of designed with that top-down approach, and a planned new city. The kind of who's been credited as the godfather of that is a guy called Melvin Webber, who came up with this term and wrote a very influential essay in the 60s called "Community Without Propinquity," which is really using the car as a way to say, we typically think of as a community as people who are living next door. You might think of this near the Ackroyd Lowrie office as your community. You've got the pub here, other businesses nearby, restaurants at the end of the street, coffee shops, you can cycle to work, etc. He was saying, ignore all of that. It's about you can have a community with other people who are really interested in what you're interested in, and the car will allow you to build that community regardless of your proximity, propinquity. And that was a really interesting idea, But as it works, these make really challenging places to practically live and to spend your time.
Well, it's quite walkable, Milton Keynes.
Well, parts of it are very walkable, but it's all the buildings are quite far apart. So one of the big issues around, I mean, we spoke in the book to the councillors who are leading trying to knit together Milton Keynes in a more cohesive way, because things like running a viable bus route there are almost impossible without massive subsidy, because everything's so far apart that you can't economically run a bus route. And so what they've done is they've come up with a really innovative approach, which is called MK Connect, which is essentially a mobility on demand approach. It's essentially not that dissimilar to something like an Uber, or a Mutatu, where you can hail a bus or a minicab or whatever it happens to be, but at a heavily discounted rate, and it works out, and then you get on your route. It's more, do you remember kind of the shared Uber that used to be pre-COVID, where you can jump in with a few other people and you then go on your route through that? There's still teething problems with it, and the kind of scalability is to be proved, but it's examples like that where you have an urban fabric that already exists. You obviously can work as architects to then incrementally increase that urban density through things like infill, through things like mixed-use developments, through things like adding new floors or whatever it happens to be. But you also need these kind of interim transit solutions about how you can actually get around these places without it having to be driven to the car, pushed to the car.
My thoughts, my predictions on this, I've sort of said already on the podcast. So I'm sure you would have heard that, but I don't think that cars are going anywhere, but I think that drivers are. And I think that's happening already in certain cities. If you go to LA, you can call a car with your phone and it will arrive without a driver, and it will take you where you want to go, and you do not have to touch the steering wheel or touch the pedals. I don't even know if you have to have a driver's license. I've not tried it, but that is so fundamentally different. It's what you're talking about. It's it's an on-demand transportation system for, unfortunately, individuals rather than communities. But ultimately, I suppose they are one at a time. You are doing this for multiple people. That's going to change our cities so radically for the better, but not maybe as far as what this book would want, right? Cars are still going to be there, but parking to a great extent won't. And that, for me as an architect, is very exciting, because I just don't believe necessarily that we can get away from the idea that you need motor vehicles to transport people or electrical vehicles to transport people. But I do think if you can get away from the idea that they need to be stored outside your house or outside your office, you free up. So in London alone, 30 square kilometres of area is given over to parking. That's 7 times Hyde Park. So all of that space can get put back into a different use. You're still going to need roads to get people around, but again, I think the whole idea of LTNs becomes less political when you don't have to have your car waiting outside your, a lot of that LTN stuff is about parking, and like, I want to be able to walk outside my house and find my car. Well, if your car just lives somewhere else in, outside of the city and comes in to pick you up when you need it, then you don't need that parking space outside your house, and you free up the space for cycle routes, because actually I think the cycling infrastructure in London is not that great. And greenery, essentially, and then you can control environmental factors such as overheating by greening the city. But I don't know that, and I think that in doing that, you will probably break this cultural idea that your car is your freedom, because your phone is your freedom, your app is your freedom, the car is not yours. And I think that will take 10 to 20 years, and it will naturally happen just through technology. I don't know what you think about that as a prediction.
Well, I think things are changing, that's for sure. And I think already we're in a situation where lots of people are car sharing for certain kinds of journeys. And what we say in the book very carefully is that, there are going to be some moments when you're going to need a car, when it's going to be the best thing, right? There are other moments when that's not the best thing. So, I live in central London, and I have no reason to use the car in central London. As it happens, I am a driver, and I like cars, but no way am I going to get in my car at the moment and drive from A to B. This is
not today particularly.
Not today particularly, but any day. And so, and actually I tend now for central London to walk most places because it is possible to do so. So things can change. But I think one of the things we're also saying in the book is that we actually need a reduction in the total quantum of cars in the city, because most of the cars in the world are in cities. Mm-hmm. We need to make our cities more livable. So whether or not they are actually driven by a person or driven by a piece of software doesn't really matter so much. What matters is what's coming off the tyres, the dust that's created coming from brake pads and so on. And this is an area which Arthur is an expert in, so he'll tell us a bit more about it in a second. But the result here is that we need actually to have more space. We need to recognise that our public spaces are public goods, which is something that architects are very good at recognising. But we need to give people much more access to them. So that means we actually need to cut down the number of times that a car is passing you as you're trying to cross the street. So one of the things in low traffic neighbourhoods, if you go up to, say, area of London, which is thought by many to be East London, although it's not really East London proper anymore because the city's moved so far east, but you go up to somewhere around London Fields, for example.
Well, we're pretty much here now.
Much here now, and you're in a low traffic neighbourhood there. One of the things that people do is insist that they want to drive their children to school. So the question is, why are they driving their children to school? Now, the distances are not great at all in many cases, right? But the other problem is if you look at what's happened in a city like Barcelona, you'll have mothers saying, well, I used to have that problem of having to rush in the morning to get the kids into the car, drive to school, then I'd be in a traffic jam, then we'd be late. Right? So now with the super block system that's come in and other changes that have taken place, the eldest child, who's now 9, can walk to school by himself, right? The youngest child goes to school with a mother and stops off on the playground on the way to school and has a little play in the playground and then goes to school, right? The mother is not in that stress situation of taking the car out. So actually the whole family's beginning of their day is a much better quality of life. And I think we need to keep in mind that yes, we will benefit immensely from the new technological changes that are coming, and hopefully we will free up all this parking that you're talking about outside people's houses and move away from the one person, one car model, which we've had. And some families, of course, have 3 cars or 4, not even just one, right?
And just to build on that, so the kind of move from this ownership to access model that you're describing and talking about is definitely a good thing. I mean, cars are static for 96% of the time, and so making better use of those cars is undoubtedly a good thing. I personally think that you're wrong on the point around it being better to move to an autonomous car mod.
I don't think I said it was better. I just think it's inevitable.
Maybe not, yeah. Or saying
there are some advantages. There are some urban design advantages that could come out of it, but there might not be. I'm not saying it's better. It's just going to happen.
So I think there'll be a world in which there is increasing a number of autonomous cars in it, and we go into quite a lot of detail in the book around some of the massive risks that will come with that as well, ranging from surveillance capitalism to capturing the attention economy and kind of using it as an opportunity to market to us. But one of the people we spoke to for the book is a guy called Ed Glazier, who you probably know his work. He wrote an amazing book called The Triumph of the City, and he's chair of economics at Harvard. And one of the things that he shared with us was this analogy of coal. So in 1865, way back when, a guy called William Jevons wrote a book called The Coal Paradox, which was saying, this is really weird. As we've got more and more efficient in burning coal, you'd think that actually we'd need less coal, and therefore we'd kind of get more efficient, and industry would improve, all this kind of stuff. But what in fact has happened is, as those efficiencies have come in, we're actually burning more and more coal because it's become so efficient. And so in a bizarre world, when in 1865, the kind of peak of the Industrial Revolution, the UK, globally we're burning about 0.2 billion tonnes of coal. And as of last year, where we have yet to reach peak coal, but as of last year, we managed to burn 8.5 billion tonnes of coal. So we're still not at peak coal, and the increase has gone up by 4,150%. And so through the efficiency, because what Professor Glazier pointed out was through removing the driver, the cost, whether we count that as an economic cost in terms of a paid taxi driver or Uber driver, or the cost in terms of us and our time, is removed to almost zero. So the cost of idling, the cost of just loitering around, going around the neighbourhood, goes to almost zero. And in doing so, you basically will massively improve the quote-unquote efficiency of being able to do that. And so you end up with more. And so in a weird way, I mean, as I say, Americans drove 3.2 trillion miles last year. If we manage to crack the autonomous car thing, and we then have a 4,150% increase in terms of miles driven, we're going to end up in cities which are completely unviable in every.
Well, I think you could have more journeys going past you every day, which is bad, but you could have more green space, which is taken from parking, right? But both things could be true. You could also have, low traffic networks are an interesting one because I think they only exist because of Waze and Google Maps. Like before that, the reason they need to exist is because suddenly everybody's trying to sneak through shortcuts because they're being told by their app that that's the shortest route. Whereas before, I don't think anybody would know. That's an unintended consequence of technology, and I think driverless cars will be the same. There'll be some good things and there'll be some terrible things. I agree. There could be just a constant circling of Ubers around London waiting for a fare. That's highly likely until they run out of battery and have to go and charge up.
Even with Ubers now, with the massive cost of having a driver there, they're not carrying passengers for around 60% of the time. So as in, it's one of those things that the direct and indirect costs of idling are massive to our cities now, and it's only going to go in one direction. So I guess the point on that is not saying we're arguing in the book quite clearly that this is not inevitable, i.e. it's not like better technology wins. This is a relatively small number of very, very, very wealthy and powerful companies who are pushing this as a way to make more money for those companies. And we're saying that we as urbanists, we as, if there are any local authority leaders or any, the Secretary of State for Transport is currently part of a consultation in terms of the role of the driverless car in cities like London. The Mayor of London, Transport for London and others are actively considering this. So it is down to people, politicians, decision makers to make decisions about what role these technologies can play in our cities. And whilst the technology may be there, doesn't mean we therefore have to let it do whatever it wants.
But okay, either way, so the current situation is bad because cars are pretty dominant, and then the future situation could be worse or could be better depending on which way it goes. But how do you make it better? Like now, if you're ignoring technological change and you're saying, okay, London doesn't allow autonomous vehicles, you've still got a problem to solve.
And we're definitely not saying ignore technological advance or change. We're saying embrace it, think about it carefully, and you can invite it in different ways. So one example of the kind of policy that could be a thoughtful way to introduce it is it'd be very, very, very difficult now to introduce a mileage tax onto Uber drivers, say, or onto me if I drive my car around or whatever it happens to be. It'd be a very unpopular thing to do. And so one of the weird things that you could do if you were to introduce autonomous cars would say there's going to be some kind of, taxation in terms of usage of that. So ways that you can manage those potential risks, and be able to build those into an economic system to be able to do it. And you may be able to do it in different boroughs in different ways. One of the benefits of dynamic pricing, which people like Uber have shown very successfully, is that you can take advantage of some of these things. So we're definitely not saying it's a universal good. We're also not saying it's universal bad. Mm-hmm. It's saying that policymakers have a very rare and amazing opportunity to think through these things in a really careful, thoughtful way, rather than saying, oh, wonderful, tech is good, welcome Waymo, welcome Uber, welcome Mr. Musk, or tech is bad, we're never going to see you again, and it's going to be always black cabbies till we die. And there is a way to thread those needles. As we were talking earlier about the ubiquity of line bikes in London now. Even a few years ago, that would be a very unusual thing to say, and that's through micropayments, that's through electric batteries, that's through service and mobility on demand models, that's through large amounts of venture capital funding going to this particular company. So there's a whole ecosystem of technologies, business models, approaches which can be done, but it's saying that needs therefore careful regulation and policy making to make it happen. And Henrietta, sorry, I've rambled on there, and I'm sure you've got stuff to add.
That's okay. I think what we should be thinking about is the fact that there are lots and lots of good solutions that are already happening. People are getting together to do things in cities right across the world. And, what a lot of people are interested in is they do feel strongly about their car. They do feel they need the car. They need to use it. But they also feel that they would like green spaces, that they'd like their kids to walk to school. Lots of people feel very strongly that children cannot really get out on the street and ramble around anymore because it's all too dangerous. And lots of people talking about that. Lots of parents would like to see a difference there. People are also worried about their health. So one of the things we say in the book is, okay, everybody already understands much of this. So now this is a moment for citizens and residents to get together and think about what they'd like to see in their neighbourhood, and to make their voices heard more clearly around those things. So instead of protesting against something once it's already happened, you need to be in that process of deciding what is going to happen for you and with you.
Well, guys, thank you so much. That was really inspiring and thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We're pleased to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on.
Pleasure.